And they've all just kind of like been writing on top of each other. But even that to be said, yes, there's a big difference between them. But to then characterize modern day devotees of Islam and to say that because of the differences between the literature will indicate that they're more, let's say, intrinsically able to commit violent acts of terror. Well, let's see. I don't want to put too many words in his mouth.
With modernity. And yes, Islam is not an accident that jihadism is a phenomenon in Islam, and it's not a phenomenon.
Speaking of people who shouldn't be talking about racial issues, we're going to quickly talk about Sam Harris. Now, some of you may know Sam Harris. He's the incredibly centrist. He's so centrist that he's incredibly balanced. He's equilibrialized, if that was the proper terminology. But he's got some thoughts. He's got some thoughts on racial issues. So I'm curious to hear what the most centrist, clairvoyant member of the intellectual dark web has to say about these kind of issues.
Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Stephen Sacker. Thanks to the internet and the mobile phone, our
Hard Talk has nothing on hard news. Let me just say that.
ability to inform, communicate, and persuade has never been greater. And yet, public debate seems more toxic, more divisive than ever before. So what's happening? Sam Harris in California, welcome to Hard Talk.
Happy to be here. Thanks, Stephen.
Sam, you have an extraordinarily popular podcast in which you talk with leading intellectuals across the world, but you also express your own trenchant opinions in a host of books that you've written. Which is more important, more meaningful to you, the conversation or expressing your strong opinion?
Good question. I think I kind of split the difference there because, as you know, I don't do much in the way of standard interviews. I'm really trying to have a conversation every time I do a podcast. So I take up probably 40% of the bandwidth in any interview. So it really is, I get to hear myself talk to my heart's content, and perhaps to the exasperation of certain guests.
When you choose guests,
who actually likes listening to themselves? Like that's just creepy. This is also like Sam Harris, by the way. This is going to be a very petty comment. It has nothing based in facts or feeling. But I think that motherfucker only has one like on Twitter. I could be wrong. Maybe he's changed that. When did this happen? First off, this isn't Sam Harris. I typed it in incorrectly. I got the wrong Sam Harris, and I'm still blocked. What? Who are you? I've never interacted with you before. Who the fuck is this? I'm blocked by the wrong Sam. God damn. All right, well, neat, I guess. Let's check out the real Sam Harris. Oh, okay. I apologize. He is like some more posts. There was a while ago when I called out Sam Harris because I was like, that motherfucker only has one like, and I was like, they're free. They cost you nothing. But as he's changed it, and I did get to find out that Sam Harris has effectively blocked me. Weird.
For the Making Sense podcast, which is listened to by millions of people across the world, do you like to bring people in with whom you know you disagree and disagree really quite profoundly?
Occasionally, yeah. I mean, a little of that goes a long way. I mean, depending on how profound the disagreements are. But I think what's important is to be able to talk about substantial issues and significant differences of opinion in a way that's civil and that converges on some kind of solution. I mean, I think the only tool
he's so enlightened. He's such a centrist that he's basically evolved.
Is conversation, and it's persuasion. If we can't persuade one another based on argument and evidence, we really, in the end, we have no appeal but to force, or force of numbers, or it's
awesome.
Really...
So I just want to use that as a jumping off point because again, he's saying that we have to be beholden to evidence, and that the problem being in this conversation, it's often lost, right? We lose out on the evidence in exchange for feelings, right? And that's the problem with the left and the leftists is we're too concerned on the feels over the reals.
There is simply no other way to influence the the thoughts and opinions and behaviors and intentions of other human beings. And so, yeah, but I'm quite worried that we have created a kind of psychological experiment, that we've run on all of humanity or most of humanity all at once without anyone's consent, wherein we've created a circumstance where people can be successfully isolated with respect to certain kinds of dogmas. They can pursue any crazy idea to their heart's content, for year after year and find support for it online. The internet is having this dual function of allowing us to get access to really the totality of human knowledge instantaneously, but it's also allowing our sense making to shatter and our epistemology to allow for a kind of balkanization of thought.
I want to turn to perhaps one of the most contentious debates, frankly, tearing America apart right now. That is race and racism, and how to respond to what many people appears to be the clear evidence of discrimination at every level in American society, including policing and the justice system. You have...
Oh, did you see his face there?
Of discrimination at every level in American society, including policing and the justice system. You have spoken out against Black Lives Matter. You seem to regard it as a form of identity politics, which you say is a poison in America today. Why do you say that?
Well, first let me say that I acknowledge that racism is still a tremendous problem in certain parts of American society and
certain
globally. And that racism is something that we absolutely have to oppose and criticize. And I mean, it is a problem for which there is a remedy, and we have been, pursuing this remedy for many, many decades.
Give us the
US.
remedy. Why are you
we've
holding
made a lot
out?
of progress, right? And
Give us
we're
the
now
fucking
living
remedy.
in a moment where we are having a kind of moral panic advertised to us, and Black Lives Matter is one of the names of this movement, and one of the groups. It's a very loose group, but it's one of the groups that is making the most noise on this.
Vosh thinks his name is Sam Cedar.
It's as though we have made no progress. It's as
Oh,
though
that sucks for
this
Sam.
moment in American history exemplifies the worst symptoms of racism, and that's quite delusional. I mean, obviously, we have made a tremendous amount of progress. Obviously, this is one of the least racist moments in human history, generally, globally, and in American history. And
But may I stop you just to point out that the obvious, that you sit with me, we're both, let's be honest, white, middle-class, comfortable, educated people who represent perhaps the dominant grouping in our respective societies. And who are you, in the end, to tell Black Americans how they should feel right now? Because so many of them look around the reality of their own lives, their children's lives, and see a system which is systemically racist, not least when it comes to the police, and they feel it is their right.
I think this is the first time anyone's told Sam Harris to check his privilege. Maybe this might this is the hard part of the talk. Now we're getting hard, everybody. Do you feel it?
Duty to express a level of anger, frustration, and an unwillingness to accept that, which is surely understandable.
Well, it's in part understandable. I mean, what is really understandable is that there is a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding being amplified. I mean, so if you're going to be outraged over the racist behavior of racist cops, or the racist consequences of systems that promulgate racism, whether there's any actual living racists around to implement those systems.
Well, it's not a choice.
Wait. What? Whether there's any living racist to implement those systems? Is that how you think systemic racism works? Like what?
We are surely duty bound to be
No, of course.
outraged by that.
I'm as concerned and as outraged as anyone is about those things, but I'm
Yeah, yeah.
doubly
Tell
or
your
additionally
face.
concerned that we not find racists where they don't exist, right? That if you're going to find racists everywhere, you're going to find the real racists nowhere, right? I mean, you're going to do an immense harm in the process. And so to take the variable of police violence is very important if you're going to worry about the consequences of racism and the way it's causing black men preferentially to get shot and killed in America. You have to find out
Preferentially.
whether in fact that's happening, right? Whether in fact black men
Oh,
are being shot in greater numbers, right, in
oh, okay.
proportion to the numbers of encounters they have with police officers, and whether they're
Oh, interesting. I mean, we have a little 1350 light, maybe a little sprinkle of it. Let's see. Let's see where we go.
if they're having more encounters with police officers per capita, there's any explanation for that other than racism, right? My concern
Oh, it's
currently
not
in
racism.
America is that any disparity you find, whether it's with respect to police violence or
If
employment.
you haven't gathered already, by the way, Sam Harris thinks of racism in the way that old cinema does, where you'll have an older white gentleman typically, and then a black person will enter a restaurant or perhaps another establishment, and he'll be like, "Y'all can't eat here, not your kind," and they'll be like, "But I just want to have a nice meal. I'm not distributing anyone." It'll be like, "You got to get out of here, N word," and that's racism. That's racism to Sam Harris. That's what he thinks when we reference, systemic racism, structural racism, hierarchies, any of that kind of stuff, intersectionality. I mean, I'm not even going to touch on critical race theory here because I think that's a fridge too far. But that's the way he sees it.
Currently on the left, anywhere you go left of center politically, the only explanation that is acceptable, and this really does have the quality of a kind of blasphemy test in a religion, the only explanation that is acceptable at this moment is white racism or systemic racism. Now, on
Oh,
the point of police violence, it just so happens that the
that's
only
the only
data we
acceptable
have
kind.
suggest that while African Americans have more encounters with the police, and I think there are obvious reasons for that, um, and they're actually in fact roughed up by the police more than white Americans are. They're not killed more. In fact, they're killed less than white Americans are per encounter, which is to say that if you come under the attention of the police in America and they draw their guns on you, your chances of being shot appear to be slightly higher if you're white at the
But
moment.
but but
Now
but
that
hang on.
breaks.
What? Citation needed, Sam. Because I mean, it seems the data doesn't bear that out. I thought we were doing facts over feelings here. When it comes down to it, I believe it's 2.5 to 2.7 times more likely that you are to be killed if you are a black American than if you are a white American when you have an encounter with the police that ends in a shooting or a violent encounter.
This is fascinating because it gets to the heart of your intellectual approach to lots of things. You are, I think, a self-proclaimed rationalist. You say that you are determined to be
He's an
driven by
enlightened
the evidence,
centrist.
by data, by the
He
science.
actually invented the term the new center because that's what he wants us to start calling ourselves, right? Those who are enlightened, those of the four horsemen.
By emotion, and still less by things like religion or any other faith-based knowledge belief system. So evidence matters. But if you look across the piece, you've alighted on one piece of evidence, but surely there's an overwhelming tract of evidence about incarceration rates, what happens to black kids in schools, what happens to black people in employment, how many jobless black people there are. There is clearly a story in America of systemic discrimination, which black people are saying right now they will no longer tolerate without expressing their anger.
I mean, one of the good pieces of news here is it's not just black people. It's the enlightened masses, shall we say, those who have woken up. And I say that distinctly because Sam Harris's, I believe, podcast is called, what is it, Waking Up? Is that it? I'm gonna have to look that up.
And when you make the point you've just made, it does sound to some like you're sort of lacking a level of compassion or even emotional intelligence or ability to empathize with the situation of the other.
Well, no. First of all, it shouldn't, because I'm concerned about the real suffering of real people. But we have to acknowledge that we compound that suffering when we give false notions about its actual causes, right? So if you're going to look at, and again, I'm on record every time I touch this topic, acknowledging that we still need criminal justice reform, and the war on drugs in the United States in particular has been a disaster, and it's especially been a disaster for the black community. All of those things should go without saying, and there are changes that need to be made there. But if you're going to ascribe the status quo across the board, the fact that there's the kind of wealth inequality and inequality with respect to crime and violence in American society that breaks along racial lines, if you're going to ascribe that to white racism, or white race or policies that white people are not changing because they advantage them, right? You will continually stumble upon errors of great consequence, right? It's simply not the case that there
are. This face says it all. this good interviewer. I gotta say, this was some hard talk. This was some hard talk. I mean, you don't even need to say anything. It's just kind of like, are you genuinely saying this right now? What? Well, I guess yeah. You're very, very intelligent in one field. You know, you're a neurosurgeon. Like, if I was to have a conversation with Sam Harris about neurology, I would be so woefully out of my depth. And the same thing if I was to have a conversation with, say, Jordan Peterson about psychology, I would be completely out of my depth. But then when those individuals start to talk about social policies and broader social implications, surprise, surprise, you get this. By the way, Sam Harris is the same individual who had Charles Murray on his podcast and started this whole arc of trying to resuscitate his tarnished career for, of course, being, one of the grandfathers of modern race realism. Like, speaking about how IQ rates are disproportionate in black communities. And I'm just pointing out the facts here, dog. And come on, these are just raw facts. I'm not saying that they're inherently lower IQ than white people. I'm just saying, as the information bears out, that's what it seems to show. And the same thing here, if we're going to talk about poverty levels and white racism or some kind of upholding the power structures from white people, we should get down to brass tacks. We should actually talk about how this affects my white sensibilities. You know, how this affects me, because it hurts my feelings. It does. I don't want to hear about this. I don't want to hear about any of this. It's icky, you know?
Are white racists with their racism producing the level of violence we see in the black community in the inner city, in a place like Chicago?
The point that many...
Oh, he's going to talk about Chicago. I bet he's going to talk about black on black crime, right? I mean, that's going to be it. Because again, it's their fault. Bootstraps, you know, come on.
Black Americans are making right now, and I'm going to quote to you the words of just one. Sincere Carabo, who works as the social justice coordinator at the American Humanist Association. He's addressed your podcasts on this issue, your interviews with other people on this issue, and he says, Sam Harris's definition of racism places an underlying emphasis on intention, and he says that's how Sam Harris defines the number of white people who are racist as a tiny, tiny minority. However, says Mr. Carabo, when discussing racism, it is important to remember it isn't about intent, it's about impact, and in that sense, it involves a far greater proportion of the white community.
Well, as stated, I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. Intention is...
Olaf the Berserker has an incredibly, incredibly good point. All right? Why don't more white people write shitty books about atheism and have shitty podcasts? Or sorry, more black people. Because if they did, they would pick themselves up from their bootstraps, right? That would solve the problem.
Obviously, if there are policies that in effect create racist outcomes, whether anyone intends it or not, we should figure out what those policies are and we should change them, right? So that's, that is what people tend to mean by systemic racism or institutional racism.
That's what they mean.
I'm completely on board with the project of discovering that and correcting for it, right? But what we have now in American society...
I can't wait to hear about it. I'm very excited to learn about systemic racism. One day, there's many other things that have to come first. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit about Chicago and black on black crime at this point.
Are allegations of racism or the experience that people are having, millions of people are having simultaneously of watching a video of, let's say, a police shooting. In the prototypical case, it'll be a white cop shooting a black
we don't have to imagine
suspect.
it, Sam. We see it. Right now, we're watching over and over Jacob Blake being shot in Wisconsin. We don't have to use our imagination.
I would tell you that video is not evidence in and of itself. That video is not evidence of racism, right? You can see videos of white people being shot in precisely the same circumstances. And we have a massive problem of guns in our society. We have a massive problem of poorly trained cops. I mean, that video in particular evinced several of these problems. One is that when someone rushes to their car in defiance of police commands and opens the door and reaches in American society, unlike in the UK, it is only rational for the cops to assume that person is retrieving a gun so he can turn around and start shooting cops in the face, which happens, right? And every cop knows this.
To move on from race to religion, you're very well known for...
Every cop knows this. There we go.
Having written a book, End of Faith, that espoused your belief that religion...
It's only rational. No, of course. Like, everyone knows that, right? If you're reaching into your car, especially, with 3 children in your vehicle, you're probably reaching for a gun to shoot someone in the face. It's only natural. You need, every cop knows this.
Preposterous, but amongst your views on religion is a clear feeling that Islam is a more malign, a more dangerous set of beliefs than many others.
I don't know if they edited it out, but I'm astounded that, Sam Harris didn't just jump on that whole thing. Like, I'm surprised he wasn't just like, well, did you actually know that, he had priors, and this was about domestic abuse, and that he had been, tasered by the cops, and that he was actually there because a phone call came in. Like, did you know that he's actually decidedly evil? And then I can look at his priors, and let's talk about that. Like, I'm surprised Sam just skirted over all that. Or maybe he did, and maybe they're just editing or cutting this out. I didn't see the horrified face from that.
And I just want to quote you something you said actually a number of years ago, almost 14 years ago, where you talked about Muslims in Europe, and you said Muslim immigrants show little inclination to acquire the secular and civil values of host countries. They exploit the values of those countries to the utmost. They demand tolerance for their backwardness, misogyny, their anti-Semitism, and their genocidal hatred preached in their mosques. I just wonder, again, if you're looking for calm, considered, rational conversation, do you think your own words there are helping?
Yeah, well, I mean, as you acknowledge, that had the kind of topspin one wrote with in the immediate aftermath of September 11th, right? I mean, this is my conversation, my style of conversation about Islam has moved on from there. I wrote a book with Majid Nawaz, a fellow.
Well, that's a really nice way of putting it. He's good at his own PR. Like, that's interesting, eh? It's just like my style was somewhat different. I had a different style then. I've changed. Okay, I've got a new flow. Have you seen my digs? Come on. Look, I'm styling now, bro.
Who used to be a Muslim extremist, who is now as rational and secular a person as you could ever hope to find. And we had a kind of debate that converged on a really a happy conversation and a friendship that became this book, Islam and the Future of Tolerance. So people can get my most recent framing of the
as
issues
Sister
there.
Rose is pointing out, by the way, the author that he's speaking about is also pretty decidedly in transphobic turf territory.
I mean, to your fundamental point, yes, it is taboo to say, wherever you happen to stand in culture, whether you're secular or whether you're religious, that religions are different with respect to almost any variable we care about. They claim different things, they emphasize different things. There are different points in their history and their engagement with.
So this is really when we're going to come down to the crux. And again, this comes from someone who was a deeply entrenched reader, a voracious reader of Christopher Hitchens. I adored Christopher Hitchens. I also adored Richard Dawkins, and I also adored a lot of Richard Dawkins' non-atheist literature as well, especially when it came to biology. It was stuff that I didn't know, evolution. I still actually quite enjoy those books. I would recommend those books. I never liked Sam Harris. I always thought Sam Harris was boring and dry. Like, the first thing I read was Letter to a Christian Nation, and I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting. I mean, it's practically a pamphlet. It's very, very short. And then the following literature I read by him, I was just, he's always just been kind of dry and boring. But we're about to get to the crux right here, because of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris became radicalized with 9/11. That's where they really started to ramp up the Islamophobia, and to the point where it's pretty distinct. Like, you'll get Richard Dawkins now tweeting out things like, oh, isn't it beautiful to hear the church bells in the chorus in the morning, as opposed to things like Allahu Akbar. Like, I'd much rather hear that. I was like, that's Islamophobic. That's really Islamophobic. And right now, what he's talking about, he's like, we have to understand that there's a metric, there's a barometer in which we can actually categorize the difference between religions. And he's not wrong. He's not. There's obviously enormous differences between the religions, even though the three main monotheistic religions, they all kind of like, plagiarize one another. Let's just say that, the Old Testament plagiarizes the Torah, the New Testament is plagiarized by the Quran, and they've all just kind of like been writing on top of each other. But even that to be said, yes, there's a big difference between them. But to then characterize modern day devotees of Islam, and to say that because of the differences between the literature will indicate that they're more, let's say, intrinsically able to commit violent acts of terror. Well, let's see. I don't want to put too many words in his mouth.
With modernity. And yes, Islam is not an accident that jihadism is a phenomenon in Islam, and it's not a phenomenon.
You're welcome. You're welcome. All right. that was way like, as someone who hasn't actually, like, I know people aren't going to believe me. I have not seen this. Okay. I haven't watched this. I didn't know it would literally be the next like 6 or 7 words out of his mouth. That was luck. Okay, that was sheer luck, nothing else.
or Mormonism or Scientology.
So
right? I mean, these are
right,
different
I just
belief
want to know. I
systems.
want to know in the real world what this means for you, Sam. Does that mean that when Donald Trump, back in 2017, imposed that travel ban, which was quite clearly aimed at Muslims, and he listed, I think it was 7 Muslim-majority countries, which, for security reasons, he said could no longer travel to the United States, were you cheering him on?
on my
But
blog.
my point is that you
no, I thought it was
characterize
an
Muslim
idiotic
immigrants
ban.
as a group of people within which there will be a small minority, you say, who are statistically going to be jihadists, which is precisely what Donald Trump would say.
Yeah, okay, but yes, hence the need to vet immigrants and refugees and have honest conversations about what we're looking for. We're looking for people who believe specific things about martyrdom and apostasy and blasphemy and the rights of women and whether it makes moral sense to hurl homosexuals off of rooftops, right? And people who are recruiting for ISIS or happy to join ISIS, or people who in your own country will drop out of medical school for the pleasure of going to live in Syria so that they might be able to martyr themselves for ISIS, right? This is a phenomenon of contagious ideas that we have to speak honestly about, and it's only happening in one religion. Now, in addition to, I mean, the reasons why I didn't agree with Donald Trump's travel ban is that, one, it was completely incoherent because it was not even targeting the countries that posed the greatest ideological risk at that point, or that were the worst reservoirs of this kind of jihadism. But two, I have long said that the most valuable people on earth with respect to dealing with this problem, people we most want in our societies, are secular Muslims and moderate Muslims and people who can actually bridge the gap.
No, the good ones. The good ones. We don't want the bad ones. We want the good ones.
Between the non-Muslim community and the secular community. And
by the way, not like 6 minutes ago, or maybe even like 3 minutes ago, he was like, "Oh no, 9/11 turned me into a racist, but I've changed now. It turned me into an Islamophobe, but I've changed now. I'm better. I'm better now. You can see that, right? That's why I came on HARDtalk. I want to get hard with you." And then of course, just nothing has changed. It's the exact same rhetoric we always had. And by the way, just so everyone's clear, it's not true. Okay, if you want to see like extremism, do you remember Kony? Does everyone remember Joseph Kony? Do you remember, like, you probably know more about the viral video than you do about Joseph Kony himself, but he was the leader of the Lord's Resistance Army. It was a guerrilla group. It was formed and operated in Uganda. They were initially purporting to fight against government oppression. They were going to purify the Akoli people, turn Uganda into a theocracy. Kony proclaims himself to be the spokesperson of God. Wow, the vicar of God on earth, and a spirit medium who claims he is visited by multinational hosts of 13 spirits, including a Chinese phantom. Cool. Ideologically, the group is a syncretic mix of mysticism and Koli nationalism and Christian fundamentalism. There's modern Christian fundamentalists that are creating terrible acts around the world. You might also know him as the one who had child soldiers and sex slaves, children sex slaves. That's right, 66,000 kids became soldiers under Kony. 2 million people were displaced internally from 1986 to 2009, again, by a Christian fundamentalist pedophile.
So we need people like Majid Nawaz and Ayaan Hirsi Ali and dozens of other secularists and moderates and apostates who I've supported, and we need them to figure out how to midwife this renaissance and within the Muslim community, where in something like Enlightenment values take hold in the widest possible way. It's obvious that I'm not going to accomplish that. It requires somebody who's in the community to do that.
Generally, people, I think, associate you particularly with a very strong brand of atheism, and there was that famous time you debated with Chris Hitchens and Richard Dawkins, and you all of you said, religion is extremely corrosive and damaging. Somebody then asked about spirituality, and while the others didn't really bite, you said, actually, no, there is room for spirituality in my life, and I'm just wondering what that means for you. Ultimately, despite everything you say about science and evidence and rationality,
hey, thanks,
do you believe in some sort of higher power, some non-human force at work?
Well, it's not a matter of believing in a higher power. It's a matter of experiencing the fact that consciousness is intrinsically mysterious.
Surf hype, virtual hug,
all of
surf
our
hype, surf hype.
most wonderful experiences appear, right? And it's the context of all of our suffering, and the mechanics of that is something we can understand more and more and change our lives for the better. But it's also the context in which human life can get better and better. And I think some classically spiritual values like self-transcendence and unconditional love, right, are at the core of any movement in the direction of greater and greater human well-being.
But he doesn't want to show unconditional love to the Muslims because they're jihadists. Those Muslims
should be at the core of any ethics we use to talk about those possibilities. So yeah, I mean, I have no doubt that it's possible to become something like the historical person of Jesus, whoever that was, or Buddha, or any of these great patriarchs and matriarchs of our religion. So there's a baby in the bathwater there that I think we don't want to throw out as atheists. But the question is, do you ever have to believe anything?
He definitely thinks Jesus is white.
In order to
that's what's going
those
on
possibilities
here.
in yourself or
it's like,
in,
oh, white Jesus,
society. And I think the answer to that is quite clearly no.
I'm just remembering close to the beginning of this interview, you gave a hollow laugh and said, I'm not telling you I'm an optimist. So when you tell me that you do believe in transcendence and you believe that we can all turn ourselves into better beings by looking within and pursuing sort of love and all of that, we're not doing it, are we? I mean, that is just, as we look around the world and around our societies right now, that is not happening.
Well, we're not doing it well. I would certainly agree. Yeah, I mean, many of us are trying, and that's all we can do is try, both personally and I think most importantly, protect norms that allow us to live by our deeper wisdom even when we are personally liable to fail, right? So we want laws and tax codes and norms of discourse that anchor us to our better selves or our better possible selves, or make it easier for even mediocre and conflicted people to behave better and better, right? And what we have rather often are systems of incentives that are set up to make even very ethical people behave unethically, right? Or even fairly honest people to behave dishonestly. And to just anchor back to the beginning of our conversation, what I'm most worried about in our style of discourse around these charged issues like race is that it is causing even fairly scrupulous and honest people and well-intentioned people to be dishonest and sloppy and actually practice a kind of politics of personal destruction where they never, and effectively to behave like psychopaths, on social media and in print and in various
psychopaths. I mean, it's cancel culture. They're the real baddies. This, by the way, is probably closest scientifically to what Jesus would have looked like, and I don't think that Sam Harris would consider him to be the Son of God, to say the very least.
Where they never would do this if the incentives weren't aligned that way, right? So I would like to change our incentives around conversations of the sort we have today, and we have a lot of work to do that.
I would agree with that. And Sam Harris, in the spirit of a strong belief in conversation, I thank you for being on Hard Talk. Thanks very much.
Yeah, pleasure. Thanks, Stephen.
This was actually probably one of the better interviews I've seen with Sam Harris in terms of like someone actually trying to hold his feet to the fire a little bit, and you could see his comfort level dipped multiple times. But yeah, nothing's really changed. Sam is pretty much the exact same way when it comes to these hardline issues. I've heard him say much worse things on other programs. I've heard him actually give pretty 1350 talking points, especially when it comes to Black Lives Matter, unfortunately. Hey, we want to mutual aid you to get some eyeballs on your work. So if you have a leftist YouTube channel or Twitch stream or something you want us to advertise, just send us a 20 to 30 second ad using the forums at weareserfs.com. We'll do our best to help you out. And please submit once per channel.
To our God, I'm Wrath. We pray at your altar of greatness. To our monarch, Thomas Bone, you are the light that guides our path. To our lords, Jeffrey Lamb, Trevor R., Stephen, Ninetails Cosmic Fox, Hans Josephine, and Poppy Nelson, we bow meekly for your pleasure. To our knights of the Round Table, Josh Mickelson, Dylan Byth, Alexander Thaler, Zach Christensen, Todd Buckingham, Todd Lajeunesse, Clement Chetska, Skybear Games, Moss Beast, Political Puppy, Ali Menthol, Jimmy Bignuts, Alan R., Andreas Chitoro, Good Poon Hates Cops, That's Solid Poon Then, Dr. Zayas, Joppy, Radiclu, Violent Orchard, and Sophie Baby, we salute you. And to our many merchants and farmers, thank you. Fuck you, Lance!